Thank you for joining me here today. If you're new, I welcome you kindly. This channel is a place where stories of family sacrifice and truth unfold. If you'd like to walk with me through these tales, don't forget to subscribe and stay close. Your presence means more than you know. Today's story is titled The Locked Room, The Truth Behind the Door. It was meant to be a day of joy. The wedding hall glowed with light chandeliers scattering gold across white linens flowers, spilling their fragrance into the air, and the music of celebration wrapping around the guests. Family filled the room in their best attire, faces painted with expectation and pride. And yet even in such brightness shadows can appear. As the bride walked past, her veil floating like a cloud, her voice carried through the chatter. Clear-cutting, unshaken father, she said, "You must open the locked room today." Her words silenced the laughter around the tables. Eyes turned one after another toward the old man, the father who had lived his life quietly, always guarding that single room in his house. The bride did not soften her demand. She leaned forward, her tone rising with boldness, almost defiance. "You've hidden wealth in there, haven't you? Why won't you give it to us?" the music faltered. Glasses stilled halfway to lips. The hall, moments ago alive with clinking and chatter, fell into a heavy pause. And in that pause, truth waited. The father sat still, his hands resting against the table, the wrinkles along his knuckles catching the glow of the candles. He had weathered storms before, arguments, whispers, betrayals, but never under the weight of so many eyes. The bride's words lingered in the air, sharp as glass. The groom, his son, shifted uneasily in his chair. Instead of silencing his new wife, he looked at his father with an expectant glare, as though her demand were justified. A murmur rippled through the relatives, cousins exchanging glances, uncles raising brows. Even the laughter of children faded, sensing that something heavy had entered the room. The father lifted his gaze toward the couple. His eyes, once soft from pride, now clouded with disbelief. He had always believed a wedding was where blessings bloomed, not accusations. His voice did not rise. It emerged low, steady, but edged with a sadness that hushed the hall further. "A locked room," he said slowly, "is not always a room of treasures. Sometimes it is only a place where the past is kept safe." But the bride pressed on her cheeks, flushed with a daring fire. "Safe, safe, from whom we are family now. Don't we have the right to know? Don't we have the right to what is inside?" A few relatives nodded their curiosity, unashamed. Others looked away, embarrassed by the greed unveiled so openly on such a sacred day. The father noticed both the hunger in some eyes, the discomfort in others, and he felt the weight of a truth he had carried for decades begin to shift inside him. The orchestra, unsure, strummed a half-hearted note before falling quiet again. The air turned thick as though the very walls leaned in, waiting for his answer. And in that silence, the father's hand trembled, not from fear, but from the pull of memory. For behind that door lay not gold, not jewels, but the sum of sacrifices he had made, each one bound in paper and ink. The moment was coming when those sacrifices would no longer stay hidden. The clinking of glasses ceased, and even the waiters slowed their steps as the father leaned back, letting the bride's challenge echo inside him. The silence in the hall was not empty. It pressed against his chest, urging him to respond. Yet before words could rise, memories flooded like a tide. He saw himself years younger, standing in that very locked room. The air smelled of dust and old paper, the shelves heavy with ledgers and folders. Each page told a story: his son's tuition paid in secret when the boy squandered his allowance, the hospital bill quietly settled when his daughter-in-law's mother fell ill, the mortgage payment covered when they failed to send a dime. Each sacrifice hidden, recorded, not for recognition, but so he would never forget how far love had stretched him thin. The voices of the present tugged him back. The bride, sharper, now leaned forward. Why keep it locked if not to hide wealth, what father hides from his own children? The son's silence was worse than accusation. He avoided his father's eyes, choosing instead to study the untouched wine in his glass. That avoidance cut deeper than the words. The father straightened in his chair, his fingers brushing the keys that hung almost invisible on the chain inside his pocket. The metal felt cold, but the weight of it was heavier than gold. He knew what opening that door would mean: the end of illusions, the exposure of truths no one wanted spoken aloud in a wedding hall. A relative coughed nervously, and the sound ricocheted in the stillness. The bride smirked, believing she had cornered him. For a heartbeat, the father let her think it. His gaze swept across the room, cousins, siblings, old friends' faces that once celebrated his generosity, now waiting like an audience for a magician to reveal a trick. "I kept that room locked," he said, his voice finally rising, "not to hide treasures from you, but to protect myself from forgetting how many times I gave when nothing was returned." Gasps rippled. The bride's smile faltered. The son shifted, but still said nothing. And for the first time, the father felt the hall itself bend toward him, not toward the young couple glowing in wedding attire, but toward the old man whose truth was heavier than any dowry. The night was no longer theirs. It was his. The father rose slowly, his chair scraping the marble floor, a sound sharper than the bride's demand. Heads turned, shoulders straightened, whispers fell silent. The hall's chandeliers cast their light down on him, not with warmth, but with a brilliance that exposed every crease of his face, every line carved by years of labor and disappointment. He placed one hand on the table to steady himself, the other slipping into his pocket. The chain clinked faintly, the keys cold against his palm. That small sound carried further than he expected. Several guests leaned forward, eyes widening, as though the rattle of metal had already confirmed hidden riches. "I have heard enough," he said, his tone low, but cutting through the air. The bride blinked, startled. His son flinched. Memories rose again like ghosts, but this time he did not push them down. He let them come. He saw the same son, a teenager, then shouting at him for refusing a new car, storming out, while the old man sat at the table with bills spread like battle plans. He saw the young bride to be smiling sweetly in his kitchen years earlier, promising she would stand by his son through struggle, while her eyes had already measured the cracks in the paint and the thinness of his wallet. "Do you want to see what is behind that door?" His voice grew steadier, and now it filled the corners of the hall. "You will. But remember this, what you find there will not make you proud, it will only remind you what pride costs." The bride's lips parted, then closed again. The son finally lifted his eyes, but in them was not courage, only fear of exposure. The father pulled the keys free, their shine catching under the light like a signal flare. The crowd leaned closer, drawn to the gesture as if it were a promise of revelation. Some craned their necks, others held their breath. Even the orchestra, sensing the shift, ceased its soft background notes. He held the keys high, not yet offering them, but letting their presence hang in the air like a suspended verdict. For an instant, the hall was frozen between accusation and confession, greed and truth. "I will open it," he declared. "Not because you deserve it, but because the lies end tonight." The words struck like glass breaking. The bride gasped, the son's shoulders collapsed, and relatives exchanged glances heavy with anticipation. The father's eyes, weary but unflinching, swept the hall one last time. He knew what came next would either redeem or ruin them all. The keys clattered softly against his palm as he stepped down from the platform. Every footstep seemed louder than it should have been, echoing in the hushed hall where no one dared speak. The bride, still clutching her bouquet, stumbled slightly as she hurried after him. His son followed, not out of respect, but out of fear, eyes darting to the crowd as though searching for an escape. The father's pace was unhurried, deliberate. He wanted each moment to weigh on them, to let their own imaginations gnaw at the silence. Relatives rose from their seats, whispers rippling the room. "He's going to open it." Children were hushed by their mothers, who themselves strained to catch every sound. The hallway leading to the locked door was dimmer than the ballroom, its light not chandeliers, but a single overhead bulb, yellow and buzzing. The contrast struck the guests like a descent from splendor into secrecy. The father stopped before the door, its surface plain wood scarred by time, a brass lock gleaming at the center like an unblinking eye. He held the keys up again, their jingle sharp against the silence. His hand trembled slightly, but his gaze did not falter. He turned to the crowd, then fixed his eyes on his son and daughter-in-law. "You wanted this," he said, his voice carrying the rasp of years. "So you will see it, not just you, but everyone here. No more whispers, no more shadows. Only truth." The bride crossed her arms, masking unease with defiance. The son's lips pressed tight, the flush of shame creeping up his neck. As the father leaned toward the lock, memories surged: nights of working late shifts, hands raw and aching, days when the house nearly went dark because bills outweighed his paycheck, mornings when he slipped an envelope under his son's door covering debts that were never acknowledged. The door was more than wood and hinges, it was the ledger of his sacrifices, and opening it would expose not wealth, but wounds. The key slid in with a metallic scrape. A gasp ran through the gathered relatives, as though the turning of metal against metal was the unsealing of secrets they had long suspected. He paused, letting the weight of the moment swell. His chest rose and fell, each breath measured. "I kept this locked," he said, his voice dropping lower, more intimate now, not to hide treasures, but to hold the cost of them. With that, he turned the key. The lock clicked open, a sound like judgment being pronounced. The crowd leaned forward, caught between dread and fascination, their faces mirrors of the tension that gripped the hall. The father placed his hand on the doorknob, ready to show them what greed had demanded but could never own. The doorknob turned with a slow, aching creak, the kind that carried the weight of years. The wooden door, swollen by time, groaned as it gave way, opening into darkness. A draft of cool, musty air slipped out, carrying the scent of paper, long undisturbed, and dust that seemed to whisper of hidden years. The crowd pressed closer, breath held as if leaning too far might topple them into the secret itself. Light from the hallway stretched into the room like hesitant fingers. What it revealed was not stacks of gold or chests of jewels, not the secret vault the bride's eyes had once imagined. Instead, there stood an old shelf, bowed in the middle, lined with weathered notebooks and binders, their spines cracked and edges frayed. The air was heavy with the scent of ink and mildew, a quiet testament to time's passing. I stepped across the threshold. First, my shoes pressing against the wooden floor that creaked like an old confession. The crowd's murmur swelled behind me, their confusion palpable. I lifted one of the thick journals from the shelf, its cover-worn smooth corners softened like stones in a river. My fingers shook not from weakness, but from the ache of memory. I opened it. Lines of neat handwriting stared back dates, amounts, names of creditors, each entry like a scar carved into paper. Every page was a receipt of nights I had chosen to carry my son's burdens, each number the echo of hours I had bent my back to cover what he squandered. Whispers turned sharp behind me. This is what he kept, not treasures, but debts. The bride's face blanched, her lips parting soundlessly, as though the room itself had stolen her breath. My son took a step back, his shoulders, stiff eyes flicking desperately between the journals and the crowd. I raised the book, my voice steady, though my chest burned. "Here," I said, "are the riches you thought I locked away. Every dollar spent to save you, every loan I paid when you walked away, every sacrifice that stripped me bare. This is the treasure of your greed, pages of what I lost." The crowd grew still. Some lowered their eyes, ashamed for him. Others looked at me with a sorrow that felt like solidarity. The bride clutched her dress, her knuckles white, as though the lace itself might shield her from the truth. I closed the journal, the snap of its cover like a gavel in the silent hall. For the first time, the door stood wide open, and what poured out was not wealth, but the evidence of a father's endless, unacknowledged giving. And as I turned, still holding the book against my chest, I saw their faces fall, not from the absence of treasure, but from the presence of truth. The room had no sound at first, just the faint hum of the wedding band outside, muffled through walls, now too thin for secrets. Then came the whispers, curling and cutting through the hall like smoke. An old aunt covered her mouth, her eyes wide with pity. A cousin shook his head slowly, as if trying to balance disbelief with shame. My grip on the journal tightened, its edges biting into my palms. I lifted it higher, my voice steady, though every word scraped my throat raw. "You wanted treasure?" I said, turning toward the guests. "But here's the treasure I spent. Not gold, not land, my years, my labor, my nights without sleep. All written here, line after line." A murmur rippled through the hall, rising like a tide. Someone near the back muttered, 30 years wasted on debts that weren't his. Another voice answered softer. No, not wasted. He gave everything for his son. The bride's veil trembled as she lowered her eyes, the flowers in her hand drooping with her. My son, standing rigid, shifted as though the weight of every eye bore down on him. His jaw clenched, but his lips refused to form defense. The silence around him was not protection, it was judgment. I turned a page in the journal. The scratch of paper against paper filled the air louder than words. See this? I pointed to a date, ink faded but still legible. The month he lost his car. I paid for it. Another page. The time he borrowed to gamble. I covered it. Another. The day the house nearly slipped away. I carried it. Each entry echoed like a hammer blow, and with each one the crowd drew closer, not to me, but to the truth now laid bare. Faces hardened, some with sorrow, some with anger. The air grew heavy, pressing against every chest in the room. A neighbor stepped forward, his voice quivering yet firm. I remember seeing you walk home late, your back bent under crates. You never said why. Now I know. His words broke something open, and the silence gave way. Murmurs turned to voices, voices to applause. Not loud, not celebratory, but steady, like the sound of rain after drought. I lowered the journal to my side. My heart, though bruised, beat with a strange calm. For years, I had carried the shame alone. Now, in this hall of bright lights and wilting flowers, the shame was no longer mine to bear. And as I looked at my son, unable to meet my eyes, I felt not victory, but the sharp relief of a wound finally shown in the light. The journal still rested in my hand, heavy with years, but the silence that followed had changed its weight. It no longer chained me, it chained him. My son's shoulders sagged, his fists unclenched, yet pride kept his lips sealed. I drew a slow breath and reached into my coat pocket. The hall seemed to tilt forward with me. Every gaze locked as I pulled out a small ring of keys. Their metallic clink rang sharper than any word spoken tonight. This, I said, raising the keys into the light, is what you've demanded for years. The key to the locked room you call my secret. A collective gasp swept the room. The bride's mother leaned closer, whispering harshly into her daughter's ear. My cousins shifted, some rising from their chairs, as though the simple act of producing keys was an earthquake splitting old ground. I stepped toward the long banquet table. My shoes echoed against the marble floor, each step hollow final. My hand trembled not with fear but with release. Then before them all, I placed the keys on the table. The sound was sharp, echoing across the hall like a gavel striking judgment. Take it, I said, my voice firm but cracked with age. Open the room if you must, but know this: the treasure you expect isn't there. What you'll find is truth, and truth burns brighter than gold. A hush swept over the hall, deeper than before. My son's eyes darted toward the keys, then back to the journal in my other hand. For the first time, doubt flickered in his gaze. A boy realizing the door he thought would grant him power might instead strip him bare. From the corner, an uncle spoke up, voice rough with anger. All these years you bled him dry. And still you want more. His words tore through the air like a whip. Another relative nodded, then another. The crowd that once stayed silent now swayed against my son. I looked not at them, but at him. You thought that room held riches, I said quietly, though every word carried to the last row. But every coin I ever had went to cover your debts, your mistakes, your demands. That locked door is not a vault. It is a grave of what I sacrificed. The applause did not come this time. Instead, the hall filled with the sharp intake of breath, the shuffle of feet, the sting of recognition. Truth was not to be cheered, it was to be endured. And as the keys glimmered under the chandelier, I knew the lock had already been broken, not on the room, but on the silence I had carried too long. The room shifted as if the very air held its breath. The keys lying on the banquet table seemed to glow beneath the chandelier. My son's hand twitched toward them, but he hesitated. For once his arrogance faltered beneath the weight of watching eyes. Open it, someone urged from the back. The murmur rippled forward until it became a wave pressing against him. He seized the keys with a sharp clatter. The bride, pale and rigid, slipped her arm through his, urging him toward the corridor. The locked room waited. The crowd rose as though pulled by invisible threads. Chairs scraped heels, clicked voices, hushed into anticipation. I followed slow and deliberate, each step echoing against the marble hall. My pulse beat in my ears. The journal was still in my grip, its edges damp where my fingers had pressed too tightly. The corridor narrowed dimmer than the ballroom's glare. Shadows bent along the walls, and the smell of dust grew thicker with every step. I felt as though the building itself knew what was about to be revealed. At the end of the hall stood the door. Dark oak, its brass knob dulled by time. How many years had it stood there, untouched, enduring whispers about hidden wealth tonight, that silence would break? My son fumbled with the ring, the keys jingling in a restless tremor. His breath came short, his jaw clenched. He wanted treasure, recognition, vindication, but his hands betrayed him. They shook, rattling metal against metal, until finally one slid home into the lock. The sound of the tumblers clicking open struck me harder than any accusation. For decades that door had guarded not gold, but the quiet sum of my sacrifices. The crowd pressed closer. Shoulders brushed against shoulders, perfume mixed with the sharper scent of sweat. A phone camera's red dot blinked in the dim light. Even the youngest children, restless minutes earlier, now stared as though history itself were about to speak. My son turned the key. The door creaked, a long, low groan like an old man waking from heavy sleep. Dust motes swirled in the narrow strip of light that spilled through. And in that instant, I felt the full shift. The secret I had borne alone was no longer mine. It belonged to the room, to the witnesses, to the truth that would not be bargained or silenced. The handle gave. The door swung inward. I did not move. I let him be the one to step across the threshold to face the truth he had demanded. And as the crowd leaned in, their faces half lit, half shadow, I whispered only to myself, "Now let them see." The door groaned wider, hinges straining against years of silence. A cool draft slipped out, first tinged with the dry, musty scent of paper and wood untouched. My son stepped in, shoulders squared, as if expecting to meet piles of treasure. The bride clutched his arm, her eyes darting over the dark interior like a predator scanning prey. The crowd pressed into the narrow hall, necks craning, breaths drawn tight. The golden light from the ballroom behind us thinned into shadow here, broken only by the faint spill of the chandelier's edge, and the glimmer of phone screens raised like quiet torches. The atmosphere pulsed with hunger for wealth, for scandal, for revelation. I stayed at the threshold, letting them enter first. My gaze followed their movements, each cautious step stirring dust that shimmered in pale streams of light. The floorboards groaned beneath their weight, carrying echoes of sacrifices. None of them had cared to know. Inside the room revealed itself slowly, not with jewels or safes, but with the stubborn dignity of age. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with old books and faded jackets, their spines bent from years of being thumbed and studied. Wooden crates rested in corners, some still sealed, others half open with papers spilling like tired confessions. On the desk at the center, a thick ledger sat closed, its leather worn soft by countless nights under my hands. The silence grew heavier. Murmurs died on lips. Someone coughed nervously. The bride's heels clicked closer to the desk, her fingers twitching toward the ledger as though it must be a chest of gold. But it was not gold. It was memory debt, every hidden truth. I stepped forward now. My shoes thudded against the wood, slow, deliberate. I crossed the distance and rested my hand upon the ledger before they could snatch it open. The room stilled, as if my palm on that cover commanded it. I lifted my eyes to the crowd, their faces pale and glimmering in the dim light. My son's breath hitched his lips, trembling between defiance and doubt. "This," I said, my voice low, but cutting through the hush, "is what you've been demanding." I turned the cover. Pages fluttered open, lined with careful handwriting. Numbers, dates, signatures rows upon rows, marking debts, repaid loans, covered hospital bills, cleared tuition, paid interest, swallowed. Each page was a sacrifice. Each line was a night I went without so they could have. The crowd leaned closer. I heard gasps, whispers breaking into silence again. The bride's face drained of color. She stepped back as though the truth scorched her skin. I slid my hand across the open pages, dust rising in faint swirls, and felt the weight of every sacrifice crystallize in that room. I raised my eyes, once more steady now, my voice no longer shaking. "You wanted to see what I hid," I said. "Here it is. Not gold, not jewels, just the price of every choice I made for you." The echo of my words filled the hollow room, breaking the fever of greed and replacing it with something heavier shame. And for the first time that night, it was not me who trembled. It was them. The ledger lay open its pages, breathing like wounds revealed. A chill hung in the air, heavy as stone. Then came the sound, a wooden chair scraping faintly from the back of the crowd. An old man, my brother-in-law, stepped forward. His gait was slow cane tapping with each step, but his voice, when it rose, carried weight. "I remember," he said, eyes sweeping the room. "When his son was in trouble with creditors 10 years ago, it was him who worked double shifts to cover it. I remember the nights his hands bled from hauling crates, all so his family wouldn't be disgraced." Gasps rippled across the faces gathered. The bride shifted her lips, parting, but no words coming. My son's eyes dropped to the floor, avoiding the gaze of kin who now measured him against the pages of truth. Another voice followed this time, the pastor who had been seated quietly near the doorway. His tone was solemn, each syllable falling like a bell toll. He came to me more than once, asking for guidance not for himself, but for how to forgive the ones who drained him. He carried their weight as though it were his sacred duty. The murmurs swelled, not of greed now, but of realization. The weight of their testimonies pressed against my son, crumbling his defiance. His fists tightened, then loosened, then tightened again, caught in the trap of exposure. I looked at him, and in that moment the room seemed to rotate. From the angle of his shame, from the trembling hands of my brother-in-law, gripping his cane, from the pastor's lowered eyes, each perspective circled back to the same undeniable truth. This ledger was no secret hoard. It was a monument of sacrifice. The bride finally broke the silence, her voice brittle sharp with disbelief. "But why lock it away? Why not tell us?" I felt the heat rise in my chest, not of anger, but of years long buried. My words came out steady, echoing through the narrow space. "Because sacrifice should not be shouted. It should be lived. And I lived it for all of you." The echo cracked the room. Some heads bowed. Others turned away. My son swallowed hard, his jaw trembling, yet he still stood silent. The ledger's pages fluttered again in a draft from the half-open door, as though the sacrifices themselves wanted to speak, to testify louder than any voice present. And in that chorus of silence, broken by testimonies and the flutter of paper, I realized the power had shifted. The secret was no longer mine to guard. It was theirs to bear. The silence had teeth now. Every breath carried the weight of revelation, and yet the room demanded more. The fluttering pages rested still, but the air held a tremor as if expecting another voice. Then came the creak of the side door. A woman stepped in, our neighbor, Mrs. Ellis. Her gray shawl draped loosely, eyes filled with the kind of knowledge that comes from years of watching without speaking. She cleared her throat gently. "I wasn't invited," she said, glancing around, "but I couldn't stay home knowing what was being said." Her gaze landed on my son, sharp yet sorrowful. "I remember nights when your father's lamp was still burning past midnight. He was calculating bills, finding ways to pay your debts while you slept soundly. More than once he pawned his own tools so you could keep your business afloat." The crowd stirred whispers, threading through the hall like sparks along dry timber. My son's face flushed his chest, heaving as if each word pressed him into the floorboards. The pastor lowered his head in confirmation, the brother-in-law tightened his grip on the cane, and now Mrs. Ellis's testimony wrapped around theirs like binding cords. Echo upon echo, break upon break, the arc tightened. I felt it all turn toward me. The ledger on the table was no longer mute. It had become a mirror reflecting years of my silence and their blindness. My hand brushed the cover, and the rough leather felt like old scars under my palm. I raised my eyes, rotating the angle of my gaze across the hall from the decorated archway, dripping with wedding flowers, to the polished shoes of my son, shifting uneasily to the trembling lip of my new daughter-in-law. I let the silence stretch, then cut it clean. You wanted the key, I said, slowly, my voice low but carrying. But this book is the only lock I ever kept. Not to hide treasure, but to hide how far a father's love had been spent. Gasps rolled through the hall. Some pressed hands to their mouths. Others leaned forward as though the floor itself tilted under them. I turned then, for just a moment, into myself. I had thought endurance was love. That silence was mercy. But here, before all eyes, I see it for what it was, blindness dressed as devotion. The thought bled into my voice as I returned to them. If sacrifice is invisible, perhaps that is mercy. But if sacrifice is demanded again and again, it becomes theft. The ledger's pages lifted once more in the draft as though punctuating the truth. And in that movement the crowd understood the room was no longer about suspicion of hidden wealth. It was a reckoning of what had been taken and never returned. The arc shifted again, pulling all of us toward the center of a climax, not yet spoken, but already trembling on the edge. The air shifted as though the hall itself leaned closer. My son's eyes darted from face to face, searching for an ally, finding none. His lips parted, but no words came. Only the faint sound of his breath, jagged and uneven, filled the pause. He gripped the edge of the table, knuckles whitening as if holding on could stop the tide already turning against him. From where I stood, I saw the boy I once carried on my shoulders. But layered over that memory was the man now trembling, caught in the light of truth. Echo and break each sacrifice recalled by others was now a mirror shattering in his hands. The guest's murmur swelled again, but it was no longer curiosity. It was judgment, sharp and unyielding. Mrs. Ellis folded her shawl tighter. The pastor's sigh cut through the room, and my brother-in-law's cane tapped once on the floor like a gavel. I leaned forward slightly, my voice steady, though my chest quaked inside me. You asked for a key to wealth, I said, eyes locked on him, but you never saw the lock on your own heart. Every door I opened was for you, and still you asked for more. His head dropped, shoulders curling inward. A bead of sweat slid down his temple, catching the glow of the chandeliers. He whispered, barely audible, I only wanted what was mine. That whisper broke something in me. I turned inward for a moment, and the thought struck like a cold hammer. What he calls his was carved from my flesh, my hours, my nights. And now he claims ownership over wounds he never bled for. I stepped closer, the weight of 30 years pressing every word. Yours, I echoed louder this time. The guests fell silent again. My finger pointed not at the ledger, not at the locked door, but at his chest. The only thing that is yours is the choice you make tonight, whether to face the truth or keep hiding behind lies. The room tilted again, and their eyes' rotation of angles shifting focus. Some stared at me, some at him, some at the locked room still waiting behind its door. The symbolism thickened, not wood and lock, but a lifetime silence about to be shattered. He tried to speak, but the sound caught in his throat. His hands shook as he reached for the ledger, then stopped midway as though the weight of the hall's eyes nailed his arms in place. The echo of my words still hung in the air, and the break was near. I could feel it. The ledger would no longer be just paper. The key in my pocket would no longer be just metal. And my son's silence would no longer protect him. The climax had begun to breathe on its own, a living thing rising with each heartbeat in that hall. The silence in the hall thickened until it felt like breathing through cloth. My son's half-raised hand trembled in midair, and I knew the moment had come. Slowly, deliberately, I reached into my pocket. The room leaned toward me as if every pair of eyes were tethered to that single motion. The key was small, its metal worn smooth by years of keeping it close. I held it in my palm, and for a moment I simply looked at it. All those years, it had been a symbol of quiet, of holding back storms behind a locked door. Now it would speak louder than any word. I stepped forward, my shoes echoing against the polished floor. You wanted this, I said, my voice low but steady. I lifted the key higher, letting the light strike it until it shimmered. The truth you think is hidden behind wood and iron. Every breath in the hall paused. The chandeliers blazed above the air, smelled faintly of flowers mixed with something sharper tension, like iron struck hot. I laid the key on the long oak table, its sound sharp as a nail hammered into silence. Gasps broke out like the first crack of thunder. My son flinched, his face caught between hunger and fear. The bride shifted uncomfortably beside him, her bouquet trembling in her grip. My brother-in-law leaned forward, cane pressed to the floor as if anchoring himself. I felt my hands steady, though my heart raced. Let them all see, I thought. Let them see what sacrifice looks like when unmasked. You believe, I said, louder now, addressing not just my son, but the whole hall, that wealth lies in what's been kept locked away. You've mistaken silence for secrecy. What I have kept, I kept not for myself, but for you, for all of you. The guests shifted, whispers weaving through the hall. Rotation of angles from the locked room to my son's face, to the key glinting on the table. Each became a symbol, temptation, betrayal, revelation. My son reached toward the key, fingers trembling, but I placed my hand over it first. The contact was final, like a gavel. My voice dropped softer yet sharper, but tonight the door will open not to treasure, but to truth. And truth cannot be stolen. His hand froze under mine. The break came in his eyes, widening as if a mirror had just cracked inside him. Around us, the crowd's murmur dimmed again, every breath waiting for the lock to turn. I could feel the weight of years pressing toward that single act, and I knew once the door opened, no one, not my son, not the bride, not the family, would leave unchanged. The echo of my words clung to the walls, while the silence after them swelled into something larger than speech. The key lay ready, and so did the reckoning. I lifted the key from the table. Its weight felt heavier than it ever had before, as though every debt, every sacrifice, every silent night had sunk into the metal. For years, it had been nothing more than a tool to lock away a room. Tonight it was a verdict. I turned toward the hall. The chandeliers above seemed brighter, almost merciless, their light cutting across every worried face. Rows of relatives leaned forward in their seats. The bride clutched her bouquet tighter, petals trembling loose and falling like pale confessions on the carpet. Come, I said, my voice carrying farther than I expected. If you want to see what I've hidden, then you shall see it with your own eyes. The words struck like a hammer. No one moved at first. Then a murmur rippled through the hall. Chairs scraped, dresses rustled, shoes tapped nervously. My son's jaw tightened, his eyes following the key in my hand as though it were a crown he deserved. He walked behind me, his steps quick and restless, while the others rose reluctantly, drawn into a tide they could not resist. I walked slowly, deliberately, every step echoing. The sound bounced off the marble walls, becoming a drumbeat that pulled the entire gathering into formation. Past the flower arrangements, past the wedding arch, down the corridor where portraits of ancestors watched us with painted eyes. The closer we came, the sharper the air grew. I could almost smell the dust that had collected behind the door, the faint tang of old paper and wood. My hand tightened around the key. For a moment I remembered nights sitting in that locked room alone, writing down numbers, each line of ink a wound disguised as duty. At the door I stopped. The crowd pressed closer, their breathing heavy, their whispers a storm. My son shoved past them, standing beside me, his face flushed. Do it, he demanded. Open it. Show them all. I looked at him then, really looked. His eyes burned with entitlement, but beneath it I caught the flicker of unease, as if even he feared what truth might crawl out from the dark. Slowly I raised the key to the lock. The metal touched metal with a cold click, loud enough to silence the room. This door, I said, my voice low, but steady, does not hide gold. It hides years. It hides the weight of what a father carried while others looked away. And tonight it will speak louder than any of us. The key turned, breaking the seal of decades. A collective gasp rose as I placed my hand on the doorknob. In that heartbeat before the door swung open, I felt every sacrifice echo inside me, the nights at the factory, the hospital bills, the silent tears wiped before anyone could see. Then with one push the door creaked open and the light from the hall poured inside. The door swung wide, the hinges crying out like old bones. A draft spilled into the hallway, carrying the dry scent of paper and cedar. Dust motes rose in the shaft of light, twirling like secrets suddenly disturbed. Inside no gleam of treasure waited. Instead, shelves lined the walls, sagging under the weight of notebooks and ledgers. Leather-bound spirals, some with corners curled by years of handling, each carried a thin layer of gray, as though time itself had tried to bury them. A small desk stood in the corner, its lamp long dark, but beside it a stack of receipts still bore faded ink whispers of payments made in silence. The guests pushed closer, their footsteps hesitant, their clothes brushing against one another with a nervous hush. "Where is it?" someone whispered. "Where's the money?" Another craned their neck, frowning. My son's wife clutched his arm, her face stiff with disbelief. I stepped inside first, the wood floor groaning under me, and the murmurs hushed again. My hand reached for the nearest ledger, its cover worn soft as fabric. I opened it to a page midway, the handwriting neat, but pressed deep as if every digit had been carved by weight. Hospital bill, April. Loan repayment, June. Tuition, September. Line after line, year after year. I held the book high, so the lamplight from the hall could touch it. "This," I said, my voice steady, but loud enough to strike every ear, "is the treasure you think I've hidden. 30 years of debt, mine, not yours. Every coin I earned, every hour I sweated, recorded here, spent on you." The silence cracked. A cousin gasped. Someone covered their mouth. The bride's bouquet slipped from her hands, petals scattering across the floorboards of the room like tiny fallen witnesses. My son froze. For a second, his confidence faltered, replaced by something raw shame or anger I could not yet tell. He reached toward a shelf, yanking down another ledger. Pages fluttered open. The same column stared back at him. He tossed it aside as though the truth burned his fingers, but the sound of it slapping the floor only deepened the echo. I bent and lifted another notebook, then another, stacking them in my arms. My fingers trembled, but I did not let go. "You demanded I open this room. Now you see. These pages are the fortune. The fortune of sacrifice." The hall behind me erupted in whispers. Some faces softened, eyes lowering. Others turned away, guilty in their own recognition. The light seemed harsher now, casting sharp edges on every tear, every clenched jaw. I placed the ledgers back down one by one, each thud a punctuation mark. I never locked away gold. I locked away the truth, because I thought perhaps love was enough. My voice broke there, then steadied, rising. "But tonight you all asked. So tonight you all learn. The room is empty of riches because the riches were spent on children who never looked back." The murmurs fell silent again. The room itself seemed to exhale. And in that breathless stillness, I felt the first crack in the wall of denial that had held this family captive for too long. The silence didn't last. It cracked like glass under pressure. A murmur rose from the back of the hall, swelling until it became voices sharp, accusing, bewildered. 30 years, all of that for them. A distant uncle blurted, his voice echoing against the walls. And still they dared to demand more. Someone else shook their head, whispering too loudly for it to be private, shameful. "A father spends his life, and the son still cries thief." I could see my son stiffen his shoulders, drawn up like a boy caught in a lie. His wife clung tighter to his arm, her face turning red. "Don't believe this performance," she snapped, her voice shrill against the heavy air. "He kept this room locked for a reason. Who knows what else he's hiding?" But the crowd wasn't with her. The rotation of faces was swift, neighbors, cousins, old friends, all turning toward me. Their eyes no longer questioned, but sought confirmation. I lifted another ledger, flipping pages with trembling hands. The dry paper rasped like brittle leaves. "Read it yourself," I said, forcing the book into my cousin's grasp. "Every entry, every sacrifice has my handwriting. My hours. My blood." The cousin swallowed hard, scanning the lines. His lips moved silently as he traced debt after debt. He closed the book with a snap, his eyes wet. "It's true," he whispered. All these years he carried it alone. The hall shifted again, an arc breaking and reforming. Some gasped, some clutched their own children tighter. The weight of recognition rolled through the room like a tide. My son tried to shout over them. "I worked too. I brought money into this family. Why don't you all?" His voice faltered when he realized no one was nodding. Instead, People drew back from him as though his words carried a sour smell. In that moment, I felt the burn of tears in my own eyes, but I did not let them fall. I stepped forward toward the middle of the room, toward the light that struck down from the chandelier. My voice carried firmer now. I never wanted to humiliate my own blood. I only wanted love. But when love is twisted into a weapon, when sacrifice becomes a chain, there comes a day when truth must speak louder than pride. The hall hushed. Even the air seemed to hold still. I raised the keys in my hand, the same ones that had kept this room shut all those years. The metal glinted under the light, a symbol no longer of secrecy, but of release. This door was never about hiding wealth. It was about hiding pain. Tonight I give it back to you all. Look well, because this is the fortune your father, your brother, your neighbor truly had. Keys clinked softly as they landed on the desk. That sound was enough. It broke something deeper than silence. It broke denial. Gasps turned into claps, hesitant at first, then stronger, until the entire hall pulsed with the sound. A public climax not of shame, but of reckoning. My son's face drained of color as applause thundered around him, each clap like a verdict. And standing there in that storm of recognition, I felt the power shift at last. The applause swelled, but I did not let it drown the moment. With slow, deliberate steps, I walked to the center, carrying another ledger under my arm. The leather was cracked, the corners curled from years of being opened and shut. When I placed it on the table, the room quieted again, the rhythm of clapping breaking like a wave on rocks. I opened the book to the first page, and my voice carried steady, though my hands trembled. Here, 25 years ago. Loan for your failed business. $5,000. Paid in full by me. With overtime shifts. With weekends gone. I turned the page. 10 years ago. A second mortgage because you gambled away the first. Paid again by me. Not once did I speak a word of it outside this family. Each sentence struck like a hammer echo and break. My son's jaw clenched, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for someone to take his side. None came. The air was dense with judgment, each breath heavy with the weight of revelation. I shifted the book so everyone could see. Ink faded but legible, my handwriting looping across the pages. Every number here is a scar. A silent scar I carried so you could stand. And now you come here in front of your child's celebration to strip me of dignity. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman covered her mouth. An old uncle shook his head, his voice low. Lord, he carried it all. The chandelier above flickered slightly, casting shadows that danced across faces, some pale with shock, others flushed with anger, not at me, but at the betrayal revealed. Rotation of angles from the trembling pen strokes under the light, to the bowed heads of relatives, to the son, shrinking under the gaze of his own kin. I let the silence stretch before breaking it. My voice softened, yet cut sharper than any shout. This room was never filled with gold, never with secret treasure. It was filled with these records, proof that love was mistaken for an endless vault. Tonight the vault is empty. Tonight it closes. The last page fell shut with a thud, reverberating through the hall. My son staggered, his lips parted, but no words coming. His wife's hand slipped from his arm, her eyes wide as she realized the crowd was no longer on their side. Then from the corner, my grandson's small voice pierced the tension. Grandpa, you did all that his question was innocent, but it was the final crack. Tears stung my eyes. Yes, I answered, my voice breaking. And I would have done it with pride if only it had been met with gratitude, not greed. The crowd erupted, not in chaos, but in unified applause, louder than before, a thunder of recognition. I felt the floor tremble under their clapping. A public climax, undeniable, unstoppable. The truth was no longer mine alone. It belonged to everyone in that hall. The applause thundered through the hall, but as it ebbed, the silence that followed was sharper, heavier. Eyes turned not toward me now, but toward my son. He stood pale, his hand frozen at his side, his lips trembling but voiceless. The spotlight that once gave him power now burned him with exposure. I let the hush linger, then spoke again, my tone unflinching. All of you here witnessed years of my silence. You saw me work late, saw me walk home in the dark. You saw me patch roofs and fix fences with these hands. And yet you believed his story that money flowed from him. Tonight the truth is carved in ink. The scars of sacrifice are no longer hidden. The crowd shifted. Chairs scraped as uncles and cousins stood their faces set. An old neighbor, cane in hand, pointed at my son. Shame on you? To take pride in a father's sweat as if it were your own. His words fell heavy and murmurs of agreement rippled outward like waves in a pond. Echo and break. My son raised his voice, suddenly desperate. I only wanted respect, I only wanted credit for once. His cry rang hollow. Gasps followed, but no sympathy rose. His words broke against the wall of truth. I stepped closer, the ledger still in my hands, the weight of years pressing my shoulders, yet holding me upright. Respect is not stolen. It is earned, I said, my voice rising, now carrying to the last row of the hall. And what you tried to steal tonight was not just credit. You tried to steal a future meant for your child, meant to inspire, not to shame. Angles rotated the bride's face, flushed with humiliation. My grandson clutching his diploma tighter, his knuckles white. The audience leaning forward, every eye a verdict. My son shrank smaller under their gaze, each heartbeat a drum of judgment. Then came the collective break. One by one, relatives turned their backs to him. Aunts folding arms, uncles crossing their chests, cousins refusing to meet his eye. The entire hall moved as a single body, a public turning away. The sound of shifting feet, the rustle of clothes, the creak of wooden chairs, it was louder than any accusation. My son stumbled back, voice cracking, you can't all turn on me like this. But the hall answered with silence, the silence of a verdict already decided. I lifted the ledger high once more, not as a burden now, but as proof carried into light. My words cut through the stillness. This room will remember not his lie, but the truth that no man's greed can erase a father's years. And in that moment, the hall erupted again. Not applause this time, but a roar of voices, agreement, vindication, a tide of community rising against one man's betrayal. My son's protests drowned under it, swept away like a whisper in a storm. The hall still reverberated with that roar when I reached into my jacket pocket. My son's protest faded into the background, his voice nothing more than static against the thrum of the crowd. I felt the small, worn object in my hand, the key. It had lived with me for years, heavy not in size but in meaning. Tonight was its night. The crowd hushed again as I stepped forward, the key glinting under the lights. The rotation of angles was complete now. It wasn't my son in the center, nor even me. It was what this key represented. I raised it high, and voices stilled, breaths caught. This, I said, my voice steady, though my hands trembled, is not a symbol of secrets. It is not a vault of treasures. It is the doorway to what I truly leave behind. My son's eyes widened, panic replacing defiance. Don't do this, he hissed, his face pale, sweat rolling at his temple. I turned my gaze to my grandson standing tall with his diploma clutched against his chest. Come here, I called. The boy stepped forward slowly, his footsteps echoing across the floor. Each step was a break in the silence, each pause a reminder of the bridge between generations. I pressed the key into his palm. His fingers curled around it, uncertain but strong. The touch of youth, meeting the weight of sacrifice. My voice rose, carrying with it 30 years of sweat. This key is yours, not because of entitlement, not because of loud claims. It is yours because you've walked the hard road of disciplined study and quiet endurance. The crowd leaned forward. I felt them breathing with me, their eyes flickering between us. Then, with deliberate slowness, I added behind the door, there is no gold, no hidden fortune, only shelves of ledgers, pages filled with every dollar spent to keep this family upright. It is my testament, my diary of sacrifice. Gasps rippled across the room, echo breaking into stunned silence. My son staggered back as if struck, his voice faltering. No, you wouldn't. I looked at him squarely, my tone both tender and final. Yes. Tonight, I end the story of my silence. Every debt I paid for you is written there, every chance you squandered. And now it no longer belongs to you. It belongs to the boy who still has a future to write. Symbolic variety, the key gleamed in his hand, the ledger under my arm, the crowd's shifting weight. Witnesses from every corner, teachers, neighbors, relatives, bowed their heads or nodded as though judgment had been delivered. Then the break. My grandson lifted the key above his head, his voice trembling but fierce. I will honor this. I will not waste what was given. The hall erupted, not just with applause, but with a standing ovation, chairs scraping against the floor, hands pounding together like thunder. The light caught the tears in their eyes. The sound washed over me like a tide. And in that thunder, I felt the balance flip. My son's lies crumbled into dust, swallowed by the roar of truth. The key no longer weighed me down. It had found its rightful hand. The applause thundered on wave after wave, crashing through the hall until it began to sound less like celebration and more like a verdict. My son stood frozen in the glare of the lights, his shoulders slumped, his hands twitching, as if he wanted to claw the words back into his throat. But it was too late. I could see it in the faces around us. Old friends shook their heads. A former teacher leaned to whisper, her eyes never leaving him. Neighbors, uncles, cousins, every angle of the room turned toward him, not with sympathy, but with a heavy silence of disappointment. That silence was louder than the clapping. Echo and break, the rhythm shifted, and the crowd became a mirror he could not escape. He tried one last time. You don't understand, he said, his voice cracking. I paid too, but his words dissolved and the cavernous hall swallowed whole. My grandson stepped forward, then the key glinting in his hand like a shard of sunlight. I understand enough, the boy said firmly, his voice young but unshakable. I know who carried the weight, and it wasn't you. The audience erupted again, the break sharper, deeper. Chairs scraped as more people stood. Hands clapped in rhythm, the hall itself vibrating with judgment and affirmation. Symbolic variety filled the air. The key raised high, the diploma pressed to his chest, my ledger clutched against my heart. 3 generations, 3 emblems colliding in one moment. I turned slowly, rotation of angles shifting once more, letting my gaze sweep the room before resting on my son. My words carried like stone, dropped into water. You took my silence for weakness. You mistook sacrifice for a purse to plunder. But tonight, everyone sees the truth. Your greed ends here. My son stumbled backward, pale and small against the blaze of the spotlights. Eyes once filled with arrogance now darted, hunted, searching for an escape. He had none. The community had become witness, and witnesses never forget. I drew in a breath, let the weight of it anchor me, then spoke again, not to him but to everyone present. This family will not be defined by betrayal, but by the future of a boy who still believes in earning his way. The audience clapped in unison, the rhythm like a heartbeat. The sound filled me, lifted me, carried me higher than the bitterness ever could. My grandson lifted the key once more, and in his eyes I saw something I hadn't in years: continuity, promise, renewal. And in that storm of sound I felt the last thread of my silence snap. I was no longer a man carrying debts for another's mistakes. I was a father reclaiming his voice, a grandfather handing forward a legacy no one could steal. The clapping slowed, but the air held a vibration like the echo of thunder after a storm. It was in that hush that voices began to rise, one by one, like witnesses summoned by truth itself. From the second row, Mrs. Leland, my old neighbor, leaned on her cane and lifted her chin. I remember, she said, her voice thin but clear, how he worked double shifts when that boy was in high school. I saw him come home, his hands raw, just to make sure tuition was paid. Her words cut through the hall like a bell tolling, steady and undeniable. Then another, my grandson's teacher, stepping into the aisle. I taught this young man for 4 years. Not once did he ever mention money as an excuse. He said, my grandfather believes in me, and that is enough. Her eyes swung toward my son, hard as glass. Tonight proves who stood in the shadows and who carried the light. Each testimony was like a stone added to a growing wall. Echo and break, the rhythm shifted, every voice confirming what I had carried alone for decades. The audience leaned forward, their faces lit by conviction. their hands twitching as if waiting to clap again to finish the chorus of judgment. I turned my head slowly, rotation of angles once more, letting my eyes catch each speaker as if gathering their words into my chest. My son's shoulders hunched lower with every phrase as though the weight of truth was finally pressing down. Then came Pastor Hill rising from the back. His voice rolled across the hall, calm but iron-edged. A father's silence can be mistaken for absence. But silence is not absence, it is endurance. And endurance tonight speaks louder than arrogance. His words landed heavy, a symbolic hammer sealing the verdict. I felt my breath tremble, but my spine held straight. For the first time, I allowed myself to speak in the first person, not just as a father, but as a man before his community. You all have heard it. You all have seen it. My sacrifices were never meant to be trophies for another to steal. They were seeds for this boy, for his future. Tonight, those seeds have sprouted before your eyes. The hall erupted once more, a tidal wave of claps, cheers, and even tears. Hands slapped shoulders, voices cried bravo, and the sound grew until it shook the chandeliers above us. My grandson clutched my arm, his eyes shimmering, the key still shining in his hand. And in that storm, I knew the tide had turned. No longer hidden in ledgers or quiet nights of labor, my story had been spoken into the open air. A lifetime of sacrifice was no longer invisible. The applause still rolled like waves against the walls when people began to rise from their seats, not just clapping but moving closer as though drawn into a circle of truth. I stood at the center, my grandson beside me, his hand trembling around that key. The chandeliers above flickered, scattering light across the polished floor like sparks of recognition. One by one, they came forward. A retired coworker clasped my shoulder, his palm rough like mine. I remember the years you skipped meals at the factory so your boy could eat better. Don't let anyone erase that. His words echoed, then broke, leaving silence so others could fill it. From the side aisle, the florist who had decorated the hall stepped forward, still holding ribbons. Sir, I saw you count every dollar when ordering flowers for your wife's memorial. You never wasted a cent on yourself. To think someone would accuse you of hoarding. She shook her head, voice breaking. The rotation of angles was complete now. Neighbors, colleagues, strangers all carried fragments of my story, weaving them into one undeniable picture. Each testimony was a mirror reflecting my years of sacrifice, and together they formed a mosaic of truth. I felt their eyes on me, waiting for the next move. My hand went to the key, resting against my grandson's palm. His eyes lifted, wet with tears. Grandpa, he whispered, voice cracking, if the room holds your truth, let them see it. Don't let the lies linger. In that moment, the decision crystallized. My son's accusations had filled this hall with poison, but these voices, these living witnesses, had turned the venom into clarity. I drew a long breath, the taste of iron in the back of my throat, and turned to face the crowd fully. You want to know what is behind that door, I said, my voice carrying over the stillness. Then so be it. The audience leaned in a collective inhale. My son froze, color draining from his face. My grandson gripped my arm tighter, steadying me. And with deliberate weight, I lifted the key, holding it high so every eye in the hall could see. The metal caught the chandelier light, flashing like a final verdict. If you believe there is treasure hidden there, I said, my voice rising tonight, we will open it. And the truth will stand. A gasp spread through the hall, followed by a ringing silence. Every head turned toward the distant hallway, toward the locked room that had waited all these years. The air was no longer heavy with accusation. It was sharp with anticipation. I felt the circle close around me. Voices hushed, footsteps aligning. The key grew heavier in my hand, but my heart lighter. This was no longer my burden alone. The hall seemed to exhale as I stepped away from the stage, the key gleaming between my fingers. The crowd parted heels, clicking on the marble floor, their whispers rising like a tide. My grandson walked at my side, his small hand gripping my sleeve, steadying my steps. Behind us, the echo of clapping had faded, replaced by the heavy rhythm of shoes and the rustle of formal clothes, as relatives and guests followed. The long corridor stretched ahead, lit by sconces that cast trembling shadows along the walls. I could hear the faint hum of the orchestra packing up in the distance, their notes unfinished as though the music itself had been interrupted by the truth. Each step I took reverberated against the tiles, carrying me closer to the door that had waited for decades. I could feel eyes drilling into my back, curious, skeptical, greedy, sympathetic. My son's breathing was uneven, ragged, as if each step toward that door tightened a noose he had woven himself. His wife clutched his arm, her nails biting into his sleeve, eyes wide with panic, though she tried to mask it with impatience. We reached the end of the hallway. The door loomed there, plain wood, its brass knob dulled by years. No grandeur, no gold, just a lock that had been turned again and again, as if I'd been guarding something fragile, not something rich. I paused, letting the silence settle like a weight. The murmurs hushed. Even the chandeliers seemed to flicker into stillness. My grandson looked up at me. "Grandpa," he whispered, voice trembling but clear, "everyone's waiting." I raised the key. For a moment I saw my own reflection in its metal surface lines, carved by years of labor, eyes weary yet unbroken. I thought of the factory air heavy with iron dust the nights my back ached. But I kept working the mornings I skipped meals so bills could be paid. Every sacrifice was etched there, invisible but undeniable. My son broke the silence. "Open it then," he shouted, voice cracking. "Show them the wealth you've been hiding while we struggled." His words rang harsh against the still air, but they bounced back empty. No echo of truth in them. I turned the key in my hand slowly. "This room," I said, voice low, "but caring doesn't hold what you think it does. It never has." A murmur ran through the crowd, sharp as a shiver. My hand hovered over the lock. My grandson's grip on me tightened, as though he feared the truth might collapse the ground beneath us. The key slid into the lock with a metallic click that cut the air. All eyes widened. The turning of the mechanism sounded louder than the wedding bells had earlier that night. One twist, two, and the seal of decades gave way. I placed my palm on the wood, drawing a deep breath, then pushed. The hinges groaned, the door opening, slowly revealing shadows within. The air that escaped was dry, tinged with paper and dust, not perfume or wealth. Behind me, the crowd pressed forward, their anticipation a single heartbeat. The moment stretched, an echo poised to break. And as the door swung wider, the light spilled inside, cutting through the dark, preparing to reveal not treasure, but the truth I had carried alone for far too long. The door gave way with a reluctant creak, its sound carrying like a confession through the hallway. Light from the chandeliers stretched into the room, illuminating shelves that sagged under the weight of time. Not stacks of gold, not trunks of hidden inheritance, but rows of worn ledgers, notebooks, and faded envelopes. Gasps rippled behind me. I stepped forward, the wooden floor groaning under my shoes, and reached for the first book. Its leather spine was cracked, the pages yellowed and heavy with ink. My fingers trembled, but my voice did not. "These," I said, holding the book high, "are the only treasures I've ever guarded." I opened it, the handwriting spilling out across the lines, neat, but pressed with the force of exhaustion. April 12, 1,997 payment to cover tuition. July 3, 2002 loan repaid for hospital bill. December 14, 2010 mortgage caught up in your name. Each entry was a scar carved into paper, the echo of my sacrifices. The crowd pressed closer. Some lowered their eyes in shame, others watched with pity. My son's face flushed crimson. His lips moved as if to speak, but no sound came. His wife's bravado crumbled, her hand slipping from his arm. I laid the open ledger on the nearest shelf, then pulled down another and another. Every page, I said, louder now, my voice filling the hollow silence, is a record of what I poured out. So you could stand, so you could live, so you could claim a comfort that was never yours to begin with. The smell of old ink and dust mixed with the perfume of wedding flowers drifting from the hall. It clung to the air, a reminder of two worlds colliding, the illusion of riches against the truth of sacrifice. I turned, facing them all. The light caught the tears on my grandson's cheeks as he stepped closer, eyes wide with the weight of realization. I placed the ledger into his small hands. "This is what your future was built on. Not hidden fortune, not secret wealth. Just the quiet endurance of a father's back bent and hands worn. For a heartbeat, The hall was mute. Then came the break murmurs, rising chairs scraping, an ant's soft cry cutting through the noise. The spell of greed shattered, replaced by the sting of truth. I straightened, every line on my face etched by years, but unashamed. My eyes met my son's, across the space between us. "You accused me of hoarding treasure," I said, my words sharp as iron, "but all I ever hoarded was debt paid for you. All I ever saved was you." The echo of my words seemed to hang in the room like a bell tolling for something long dead. And in that stillness, the legacy of sacrifice stood bared for all to witness. The room fell into a long hush. Dust danced in the golden spill of light, settling on the ledgers now stacked on the table like silent witnesses. My hands, once trembling, grew steady as I closed the last book and set it down. Behind me, someone began to clap. It was faint at first, uncertain. Then it spread one after another until the hall was filled with the sound of palms meeting like rain striking a roof. The applause carried not just noise but recognition. A lifetime of invisible labor was no longer hidden in shadows. My grandson stepped forward, his small frame shaking, his voice barely above a whisper. "Grandpa, I'm proud of you." His words landed softer than any insult ever thrown at me, and yet stronger than any applause. I placed my hand gently on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of a bridge rebuilt. My son, red-eyed and silent, lowered his head. The arrogance that had once filled the hall in his voice was gone, replaced with something rawer, shame perhaps, or the first hint of understanding. He did not speak, but in his silence I heard the weight of what could no longer be denied. I looked around, seeing faces of relatives, neighbors, friends, all standing, some wiping their eyes, others nodding as if to say, "Now they know." The truth had been laid bare, and though it cost me years of sacrifice to write it tonight, those pages spoke louder than I ever could. With slow steps I left the room. The door shut behind me, not with bitterness, but with a finality that felt almost merciful. The ledgers would remain a testimony, but I no longer carried them alone. I walked past the flowers, their fragrance sweet and fleeting, past the music that had stilled and was now tentatively returning, past the hall that had been a stage for both accusation and redemption. My heart, though heavy, carried a strange lightness, like something long buried had finally breathed its last. And to you who have listened to this story, I offer my gratitude. Thank you for walking with me through shadows and into light. May your homes be filled not with the weight of unspoken debts, but with the warmth of honesty and love. Take care of your families, treasure the ones who truly stand by you, and let kindness be the legacy you leave behind. I wish you health, peace, and happiness for you and for your family.